It's time for Talking Michigan Transportation, a podcast devoted to the conversations with people at the forefront of the ongoing mobility revolution. In the state that put the world on wheels, here's your host, MDOT Communications Director, Jeff Cranston.
Once again, welcome to the Talking Michigan Transportation podcast. Today, I'm going to be talking about excessive speeding and how the experts think that factors into our disproportionate fatal crash rate. Even though traffic was down as much as 60% at the beginning of the pandemic and leveled out at about 18 to 20% down. We saw more people killed on Michigan roads in 2020 than 2019, and it's really troubling. And first, I'm going to be talking with Lieutenant Dwayne Robinson of the Michigan State Police about what he's seeing in terms of citations and in their investigations of crashes. And then later, I'll talk to Dr. Peter Savolainen from Michigan State University, who has some expertise in speeds and how they factor into severity of crashes. So first, Lieutenant Robinson, thanks for taking time to do this.
Thank you for having me today.
So just tell me, what you've been seeing over the course of the year since the pandemic started, and, what the folks that are in your post are seeing on the roads.
Well, pretty much what the rest of the state has been seeing, and that is excessive speeding on our freeways, mainly I-94, US 131, I-75, those stretch of roadways. If you remember back early when the pandemic struck, there was that lockdown statewide, and actually nationally there was a lockdown because we really didn't know how to address this onslaught from this virus. So you had people still commuting to work, and when in normal conditions and situations where there's road traffic out there, it kind of adjusts itself because there's so much traffic. But suddenly commuters all of a sudden had an open highway, and they didn't have the traffic jams, and they didn't see a lot of police presence, or at least they thought that police presence was had slowed down, and they took advantage of that and put their foot on the pedal and pushed it. And everyone knows the faster you go, when you crash, your likelihood of a serious injury or death goes up exponentially. So we really have been stressing through social media and through news releases to the public to be mindful of their speed and to let them know, law enforcement, we are still out there, we are still ticketing, and we're pleading with them to please obey all traffic laws, because it's kind of selfish too when you think about it. And what do I mean by that? Well, we have all these people who are in the hospitals for COVID, and we need the doctors to care for them and the nurses and whatnot. And when you put yourself in a situation where you crash out and you need to go to the hospital, now you're taken away from the people that are suffering from this pandemic, where that could have been prevented if you'd had just done the speed limit and not been so selfish.
That's a really good point you make, that people that might get caught up in these crashes were harmless people on their way to work to do something important to the cause. So that's a really good point. So what are you hearing? What are you and other troopers hearing from people when they get pulled over for speeding? Is it just, gosh, I just didn't realize how fast I was going because, I had an open highway and, I just wasn't paying attention? What kinds of things do people say?
The typical, defenses. I'm late for work, trying to get to the school to pick up the kids. The car drives so smooth, I didn't realize how fast I was going. All kinds of excuses. And, we've been telling them, hey, look, we know that the highways are open. So why don't you use that old technology of cruise that we all, have in our cars nowadays, set it so that everyone's out here can continue to be as safe as possible out here on the roadways. So
not only is there cruise on top of, all the other the new technologies, including auto braking and adaptive cruise control that sets you so many car lengths behind. most cars now, modern cars, have alarms that will go off. You can set it for a certain speed to alert you if you've exceeded that.
Yeah, it's just so as always, Michigan State Police, our goal when we pull cars over for whatever traffic violation, first and foremost, is to educate and to redirect. And so we have been doing a lot of educating. We are handing out tickets when necessary, but our ultimate goal is to just educate the public on the importance of following the traffic laws, including speed laws, so that everyone can get to their destination safe, and so that you don't cause a crash that kills someone else's family or send someone else's loved one to the hospital.
I think a while back I talked about this with Lieutenant Shaw, one of your colleagues over in the metro region, and he said that you're also seeing, increased instances of non-seatbelt compliance.
Yeah, that's been something that's been detected as well. We don't quite understand. We just, there's so many hypotheses out there that people are, coming up with as to, the other side effects of being in this pandemic here. And that is, people are just letting their guards down. You've been trained and retrained and educated and re-educated on road safety. And then the moment it looks like, the world has been shaken, you lose everything that you've learned. You just throw it out the window. And you just can't do that. I mean, we all were kids growing up, and all the values and morals our parents put into us, you don't suddenly just throw them away when you become an adult. In fact, you kind of double down on them, because now you're out on your own, and dad and mom not watching you. So you have to do it on your own. So with the roadways being, as less traveled, and you may not see as many law enforcement officers out there, don't throw away the values and the morals that that you've learned over the years, and regulate and self-discipline yourself to do what's right.
That's good advice. I wonder if, I don't remember anybody, at MDOT talking about this, but I wonder if we should have seen this coming, that for a while, when there were so many fewer cars on the road, that speeds were going to go up, if that could have been expected, or did that take us all by surprise?
I think we were all in shock, Jeff. That thing hit us like a storm, like an earthquake. It shook us. Every sector of our lives, businesses, work, schools, how we shopped, went to the grocery store. It just kind of shook us. And so I think people, were just, some people, quite frankly, took advantage of the situation. Some are just inundated with stressors of life. But that's why law enforcement are here, and that's why MDOT's here. We're here to reinforce those things, those safety measures that we stress all year long from our capacities to try and maintain a safe roadway for all drivers here in Michigan.
Yeah, I think that a lot of people would be surprised at how personally the engineers who design the roads, and how the troopers like yourself, who are out there trying to keep them safe, how personally they take it, when there are crashes, and when people are not driving safely, that it really bothers them. They feel like, I spend all this time trying to keep people safe, and yet these things keep happening. So I think everything you said is probably good counsel.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of our main, like I said earlier, educating the public. That's our ultimate goal. We don't want to hand out $125 tickets, especially now. People are just trying to live, day to day, with their bills and groceries, and just putting gas in the car. So the last thing we want to do is hand out a ticket, a fine and cost to put a burden on people's financially. Yeah.
Well, thanks for taking time to do this, Lieutenant Robinson. Let's hope that as things start to return to some semblance of normal, that so does driving behavior.
Absolutely. And thank you for having me today.
All right, so I'm back with the second segment of today's Talking Michigan Transportation podcast, and I'm pleased to have with me Dr. Savolainen from Michigan State University, and he's somewhat of an expert in these issues that we're talking about involving speeds and crashes and the severity of crashes at higher speeds. It seems like basic physics, but there's a lot more to it than that, I think. So I talked earlier with Lieutenant Robinson of the Michigan State Police about the trends that we've seen basically since the pandemic started. Traffic, as you know, was down as much as 60% in the immediate weeks after the shutdowns, and then bounced back, but ended up at the end of the year still down about 20%. And yet we had more people killed in car crashes in 2020 than we did in 2019. And everybody seems to agree that it's mostly all about speed. Is that your take?
Yeah, I think certainly speed's the one bigger factor, just getting back to the fundamental nature of how we drive. And if there's less traffic on the road, we tend to drive faster as a consequence of that, because we do a pretty good job of trying to minimize our travel time from point A to point B. And safety, I think, is largely incidental to that. We're not actively thinking about what the risks are, because if we think about it on a per driver perspective, our likelihood of being involved in a crash is very, very, very small. And there's got to be a combination of factors that, contribute to these crashes occurring. And since we tend to be traveling at higher speeds when the crashes do occur, back to your point, the fundamental physics are kind of the determining factor in terms of how bad the consequences are. And so, yeah, I would suspect that a lot of this is being driven almost exclusively by speed.
So there's all kinds of talk about education efforts, and we know I've talked to people at the national level about this and what messages resonate. And like you said, people of all ages, especially younger people, tend to think it's never going to happen to them. So I don't know. What do you think gets to people that can make them actually think about driving more safely and altering their behavior?
That's a great question. That's kind of the $1 million question that's been facing the engineering and enforcement and education, the whole broader safety community over time, is that driver behavior is inherently difficult for us to change. And so, there's research, there's some things that we can do from an engineering perspective. If we want to reduce speeds, we can try to design the roadway so that drivers aren't as comfortable traveling at those higher speeds. And so that's, one perspective approach to that. Enforcement can play a role, but there are certainly some limitations related to budget and other factors, and if we look at, for example, the political climate there, I can understand why there may be some reluctance for large scale enforcement as well. And then if we look from an engineering perspective, just broadly speaking, it's very easy for us to give advice to others, but less easy for us to necessarily, take that advice ourselves. And so I just thinking about my own experiences, when I first had my first child, I think I had started to change my behavior a little bit when I'd have the child in my car with me, that sort of compensation effect. And then over time, my driving has probably reverted back to less conservative in nature, and so I think, if you have personal experiences in crash or near crash events, or if you're aware of people, family or friends that have been involved in crashes, things of that nature, I think that tends to resonate. But it's really a difficult problem to address in Michigan here and nationally, because I think in current times, we're constantly under pressure, to get to and from work as quickly as possible. And we tend to be somewhat impatient, driving for recreational purposes. There's enjoyment factors there as well involved. And so it's really just this mix of factors, and there isn't really a silver bullet necessarily here. And so I think that's really a concern to everyone involved here, is just trying to better understand, the nature of this problem and what we could potentially do to address this. And I think some of these concerns are exacerbated by the fact that we did increase speed limits across Michigan back in 2017. And, speeds have gone up as a consequence of that. Crashes and fatalities have generally gone up as well. And if you look at where there's pushback and reluctancy from the public standpoint, it would be those people that are most directly involved. So we'll hear a lot of complaints, say, in small towns. So I'm from the Upper Peninsula. And you don't necessarily like those people coming into town, 10 miles per hour faster. Even if we drop the speed limits, there's a general tendency, and this has been borne out by research, that some of those speeds can potentially spill over and you still have higher speeds even in these towns where we've posted the speed limits to be lower. And so unfortunately, I don't have a great response or a great solution for you. And so I think that's something we're continuing to try to work towards as a collective traffic safety community.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about, having children, and the first time that you wrestle that child seat into your car and go through, the hard work of making sure it's in there properly and that you've everything fastened down, it really kind of resonates. And you're probably right that once you get past those years, you kind of forget about it again, and that's human nature. But I think too that it seems like all that we've done, with technology to make our cars safer, with adaptive cruise control and auto braking and all the things that we know are going to lead eventually toward automated driving. And what's really going to make us safer is taking the human out of the equation. But in the meantime, our cars are also, they ride smoother, and that makes it easy to get going faster. So I'm a firm believer that until we get to that point, we can't human-proof the system, right? There's no way to build roads and design intersections and freeways so that they're going to be free of crashes. They're going to happen, and crashes are because we're humans. The same reason they put erasers at the ends of pencils. So I just wonder long term if you think if speeding is something we should be looking at. Is it we did raise those speed limits, and some of your colleagues at Michigan State were involved in some of the studies and some of the testimony and some of that research. Are we going to be looking back at that in a few years and thinking we went too far?
That's a great question. And I mean, the preliminary data to that end, like I said, does suggest that crashes are up, fatalities are up, but this really mirrors trends that we've seen nationally. It's not just Michigan that's increased limits. At least half the states, if we go back over the past 10 years, have increased the limits on their highest speed roads. And so if we look at the response from the engineering community, there have been some projects and some research that is, I guess, conceded to the fact that, well, speeds are going up. So what do we try to do to make, the consequences of these crashes less severe when they do occur? And that gets to some of the driver assistance type systems that you had referred to there. So obviously things like adaptive cruise control, forward collision warning, automatic emergency braking, I think there's a lot of potential there. Interestingly, if you look in the research literature, there's also what's referred to as a risk offset hypothesis, where as vehicles become equipped with these enhanced safety features, people tend to drive in a riskier manner once those systems are equipped. And so it's a real challenge. And so, if we're looking long term, sure, we've got the potential of self-driving vehicles down the road. There are a myriad of issues that need to be considered there, because a lot of people, just enjoy driving, for example. And so I think there's a lot of unresolved questions there. In addition to people loving to drive, they love to drive fast, frankly speaking, as well. And so,
I get that, and I think maybe there'll still be tracks where people who really love to drive can drive, because there's still places people can ride horses. So if that's really what you're all about, but I mean, when you weigh that against 40,000 people a year being killed, I know you've heard all of the metaphors and all the comparisons, but would we tolerate 400, 100 passenger planes going down in a year? I mean, it's incredible.
No, I completely agree. And I use that exact same analogy in my highway safety course. And so I'm right in lockstep with you there. And I don't have a good sense how knowledgeable the public is about the seriousness of this. Now, for example, MDOT has used its roadside dynamic message signs to provide, year-to-date updates of traffic fatalities as an example. And I think that helps to bring the message home to a degree. And we've run some survey work as a part of some of our research projects that have shown that the public is receptive to those types of messages. But still, if you compare car crashes to various other types of killers, various types of diseases and so forth, it's very high up on that list. But that message, for whatever reason, hasn't really resonated as much. And I'm not necessarily sure of the reasons for that. And I think if we think about just the speeding issue in general, we also have some other factors that make that issue more severe. So if you look at fatal crashes, there's an overrepresentation of fatalities at night. And so at night, we can't see as far ahead in the roadway. And so if you're going at higher speeds, it's more likely you're going to be involved in a collision, for example. Fatalities.
And there was a time when we had lower speeds at night. We had lower speed limits, right?
Absolutely. And things like drinking and driving, part of the reason there's such an overrepresentation of fatal crashes there is that your functional ability is just degraded. You don't have the reaction time, you don't have the visual acuity. And if you're driving faster and also under the influence, these problems are just exacerbating one another. And then I guess the third example there would be distracted driving. And, just think of the analogy, if you're going 5 or 10 miles per hour faster and you're looking down at your cell phone, you're traveling that much further. And so, if we look at the pandemic specifically, back to your initial question, I'd say that the one big factor that's changed is just how many people are on the road, but we haven't changed many of the bad driving behaviors and practices that we have. And I would suggest that a lot of those behaviors are probably more prevalent now because people may be more likely to drive distracted if there's less traffic on the road, and things of that nature. And so, we're continuing to learn more about this, but it's clear that we just have some fundamental issues here that are very challenging to deal with. And it'll be interesting to see what solutions we may come up with to try to address this moving forward.
Yeah, and the state police and other investigative agencies have also seen a trend in not as many people wearing seatbelts, which is also troubling and hard to figure out, why that coincides with all of this. I don't know. There are a lot of theories about that too. That why are people in such a hurry during a pandemic? There's a lot of things that just don't make sense. But I really appreciate your insights, and I think as this goes on and you and your colleagues do more research and more study, this is something we'll want to talk about some more. So thank you very much for taking your time.
Absolutely. Appreciate it. Thank you much.
That's a wrap for this edition of Talking Michigan Transportation. Check out show notes and more by subscribing on Apple Podcasts.